To help us launch into our show, I'm super excited about our special guest, Dr. James Robertson. He's the author of the book Overlooked, and he's here to help us understand the history of the church in our country and what Christianity is like in our nation today. Welcome, Dr. Robertson. Thanks for being here, James. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I'm super intrigued. Overlooked, what do you think that means?
Well, first off, I'll give thanks to Alicia Wilson for actually picking this title. It was perfect. Overlooked kind of factors into two different ways. One, I think as Canadians, and definitely for those of us who were raised here, we definitely feel like Canada as a nation tends to be a little overlooked, especially when I compare ourselves to our big, beautiful neighbors immediately to the south. So kind of playing at that Canadian inferiority complex. But to your earlier statement too, this idea of a broken world, what can we do? As I was sort of looking at a historical look at this overarching topic of secularity, I realized we kind of overlooked some interesting elements that are unique to Canada and to Canadian Christianity. And so I wanted to highlight a few of those for any of the readers.
Oh, great. Okay, so let's dive into a couple of those. Okay, so what are some of the things that you've observed that you think most Canadian Christians specifically overlook about their own heritage?
Ooh, it's a good one. So I'll start with the provocative one, because anybody that's read this or talked to me can't stand when I say this. One, Canada is historically a nation of losers. And that's, yeah, so good.
Are you a Toronto Maple Leafs fan?
I'm a Flames fan. I feel your pain. What I mean by that, quite simply, is this. We start with a variety of indigenous peoples that obviously were here thousands of years before any European set foot here, and the relationships they've been having since about the 1500s. Then, of course, the French were the first to settle here, and in the Plains of Abraham, they lost to the British. And then, most importantly for English-speaking Protestants of a Protestant background is, of course, English-speaking Canada was a creation of the American Revolution. And these are people who stayed loyal to the crown that found life in the new American Republic not super inviting. So they went north to British lands. So between the various indigenous peoples, the French, and now the losers of the Revolutionary War, we have a land peopled with those who know what it means to be on the losing side of history. And that tempered the early Canadians' objectives and goals and dreams and ambitions.
Well, that's fascinating because, again, it's one thing to observe it and to point it out, even if we don't want to hear it. But what have you learned that can be a positive on that? Like, what can we learn about that so we can change that narrative?
Well, and that is the, to borrow from William Blake, that's the universe in the grain of sand, is one of these beautiful elements of the gospel. And I would say historically about Canada is we have an entire national culture around finding meaning in being overlooked, not considered. And there's actually a strange pride in that. We all know the great Canadian pastime is hockey, but of course that's not true. That doesn't take a lot of Canadians into consideration. But one thing most Canadians, our true pastime is taking the moral high ground against specifically America in the recent years and sort of looking down our noses. I always find that's the true Canadian pastime. But in that, there's a beauty of when I look at the messages of Jesus, when I look at the earliest Christians, who of course were operating on the underside of power for the first 3 centuries of the Christian church.
Right.
Well, Canada has that just sort of in our DNA, which is why I think it is important to go back to the early stages of Canadian culture, because of course these are the building blocks of what would become Canadian culture. So why pursue power when we have all the tools we need to operate in a place of less power?
Oh, I love that because yeah, you're right. I think most Canadians do feel inferior, overlooked. As a matter of fact, I have observed that when anyone in Canadian culture kind of rises to the top, we pull them down. You talk about hockey. Wayne Gretzky, when he's at his best, most Canadians don't actually like him. The total opposite of the idol worship, I suppose, in America.
Right.
But I think that's so profound because the gospel speaks to that God actually uses humble and small things for great things. You talk about the disciples, you talk about the people that he encountered and touched in his life. And so for Canadians, that's hugely optimistic. So
it is.
What are some of your possibilities, let's use that word, that you see as Canadians because we identify that way?
Yeah, so I think some of the realities are, so let's look at Christianity's influence over culture. And there's going to be a few connections between sort of our story and the American story. But of course, we also inherited the British story. And again, the British Empire what's unique about Canada is that it comes to fruition in an age of empires, but also in an age of revolutions, like the American Revolution inspires France, Ireland, similar places like that. So what Canada in the early days, of course, at that point, it's British North America, finds this unique way to navigate between the might of the British Empire and the might of the American Revolution, and sort of builds together something that is both and neither. And that's what you can start to call Canadian. And of course, it develops over time. So the practical realities of this land, just by one example, is Canada doesn't have a Bible Belt. So if we're looking at Canada's influence over, for example, the realm of politics or policymaking or whatever, American, especially evangelicals, do have a large voting bloc with which they can draw upon that at any given time. They can mobilize very quickly. The same is not true in Canada. We are a vast country. We have 1/10 of the population, and that's been kind of the Canadian story. So we need to look at Canada as a collection of countries, a collection of nations, regionalisms. So to unite people into an influential bloc is much trickier north of the border.
Super interesting. Okay, so what are some of the other observations that you've made? What other ways do you think that Canadians are ignoring some of their history that they need to pay attention to or feel overlooked?
Right. Do you want provocative or important? Which should go next?
Can you combine those into one or whatever you like? Yeah, whatever you've noticed.
Actually, yeah, I can. All right. So here's the next provocative statement. Revivalism, and when I speak on these conferences, when I meet with church leaders and whatnot, I inevitably hear somebody's like, what Canada needs is a big, like a revival. And while I'm very sympathetic to that point of view, revivalism doesn't do in Canada anywhere near what most Canadians think they do. We are not a revivalist nation. Now, here's the I always say heretic and historian both begin with H for a reason. So historically, of course, this is a land of Amy Semple McPherson. We had the Methodist camp meetings throughout the 19th century, the Hamilton revivals, of course, the Toronto Blessing, the Hebden Mission in the early 20th centuries. So this is a land familiar with that revivalist strain. But thanks to people like Michael Wilkinson and Linda Ambrose and their beautiful book on the PAOC called After the Revival, they provide for that denomination one really important argument that I see coast to coast is revivalism doesn't have legs per se in Canada, not in the way it does in the States. So the groups that do well, the groups that influence society, the groups that last are the ones that frankly calm down and organize. That's that sort of British echo that continues on with us. Now, where I want to give people hope, it's not that I'm advocating against revivalism. That would be probably wandering into heresy. But I want Canadians to really look at how do you define revivalism. And historically, it is a beast of a much different stripe than, again, I'll say the American version, and we can get into that if you want to, but also in the British version, places like the Keswick movement, there's definitely influence over 19th and 20th century Canadian Christian culture. But revivalism is a much different character in the Canadian story.
I think that's so good. And we're running out of time and I'd love to have you back because there's so much we could talk about. But I think my takeaways for today are that, yeah, we may feel like we're overlooked, but God can use us anyway. And actually is bringing the nations of the world here. And you're right, revival for us probably is going to look a lot more relational rather than like a big movement. And to embrace that as followers of Jesus, as Christians in our local areas is really, really important. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate the work that you've done. If you want to see Dr. James's book, you can go on our website and you can pick it up there. Thanks so much for being here with us here today.
Bill, real treat. Thank you very much for having me.